Hi, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Better Events Podcast. I'm Logan Clements, one of your co-hosts, and in this week, we are sitting down with Gabriella Robbucio to talk all about mastering relationships in events. She takes a wide view at first, talking about why it's so important, and then we dive into all of those critical stakeholder relationships, talk about conflict management, and why we are in the business of people. I had to stop myself. I was jotting down some notes during our interview that she had some things that helped relationship management for me click. So this is going to be a great episode. We also get into leadership skills and how that applies to the teams you lead and the vendors you work with. And then we end with some interesting tidbits she's got for you, particularly because we're at the end of the year and some things to think about as you prep your processes for that end of year, end of Q4, but also as you look into 2025. So without further ado, let's get into the episode.
Welcome to the Better Events Podcast. Join two event strategists, Logan Clements and Mary Davidson, who believe we can all create, host, and attend better events. In this podcast, you will learn about event strategy and actions that you can use today as an event host, planner, or manager. Hear directly from the people who are creating innovative and inspiring events today and tomorrow, and grow your business along the way. Now, let's get started, and thanks for listening to the Better Events Podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another week of the Better Events Podcast. We are so thrilled to be with you as always, and we're even more thrilled to introduce you to our guest today. But before we get into that, we want to remind you about the 2024 Better Events Conference that's happening December 18th and 19th. December 18th is in Tacoma, Washington. December 19th is virtual. And we have so many awesome things that we're excited about. You can check out more information at bettereventspod.com/conference. But one of the things that I'm excited about is just to interact with you all. Logan and I have some moments when we're going to be on stage, if you will. But for the most part, we also are just trying to hang out with you all. And so we always love getting to know you a little bit better. This is a wonderful opportunity for that. So that's one thing I'm personally very excited about. So we hope to see you there. Now, we'd love to introduce our guest, and Logan, our co-host, is going to introduce her today.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, we are always so excited for our guest listeners, but this one's all about mastering relationships and events, which is a topic that is so relevant, and I'm excited for you to come back to this episode time and time again whenever you need a refresher. But I am thrilled to introduce our guest, Gabby Robbucio, who is the founder of ProEventTips, an event management consulting company where she draws on over a decade of experience in high-stakes event production and relationship management to help provide skills and training to fellow event professionals. With a background that spans global sports broadcasts and transformative fundraising events, Gabby shares invaluable insights and practical tools to help planners build resilient, lasting relationships with stakeholders, vendors, and teams. Whew, Gabby, is there anything you'd like to add to that wonderful intro?
No, that was a lot of words. As I'm listening to you say that, I feel like kindred spirits here because I have the whole events background like Logan, and then I transitioned into fundraising like Mary. So that's probably why I've gravitated towards your podcast, as you hit on both of my worlds.
We love that. It's fun to come from both worlds and kind of bring that perspective. So we're excited to hear more about that and to have you. And we like to do a little bit like why we invited our guest. And so Gabby's a longtime friend of the podcast. She's a wonderful supporter. So Gabby, we're just like so grateful for you and grateful that you're taking the time to be on the podcast and share your knowledge. You're a super active community member. And one of our meetups, we kind of learned more about your relationship management work that you've been doing and learning about and all of that those wonderful things. And so when it comes to events, that's such a cool twist. And so we were excited to hear about it, and we're excited to bring it to our listeners on the podcast. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to share it. This is my baby here. So I'm happy to bring this to you guys and the whole crew.
Awesome. And as you know, we love to start really basic when we're talking about a topic. And so for our first question, can you just start with how you define stakeholders for event pros? Because that's kind of what we're talking about. And a great place to start is, who are these stakeholders? What does that mean?
Yeah. And it sounds so rudimentary and basic when you ask it, like that. And I get asked all the time, what is stakeholder management? What are relationship management? And it's what I don't think people understand is that in the events industry specifically, stakeholders are anyone, any group, any individual that touches your event. So when you're in charge of managing an event or working on a team, you have to make sure that you are acknowledging, I mean, you have attendees, you have vendors, you have sponsors, you have, if you're, a corporate event planner, you have your CEO, your other internal departments. You also have like the parking attendants and the fire marshal, like all of those people are vested stakeholders in your event, and you have to manage the relationships with all of them. So stakeholders is so much more encompassing than I think people realize, and that's something that's very specific to events.
Yeah. And I think, events are all about people. And I think that's for better or for worse. It's a really great way to weed people out who aren't who don't think they actually like events, because it is so much about the people and those relationships. So you started to touch on it a bit, Gabby, but why is relationship management so important for event pros?
That was like the perfect segue that you just said that. So as event professionals, we are people's people. Like, we are good with people. That is, you have to like people, you're around people, you're working with people. That's, everyone expects us to just be good at it. But no matter how good you are at that, it is a learned skill to be able to manage the number of complex relationships all at the same time while also planning an event. So relationship management is, the way that I look at it, it is the way that you as an event professional can balance your time and your infinite resources, your budget, your time, your attention, because each stakeholder requires some level of participation, or they expect something from you. It's being able to understand at what level each stakeholder actually needs that. So you are creating your own boundaries and making sure you don't lead yourself to burnout, which so many people in this industry experience. It's like, we're expected to be everything to everyone. You can't do that at all times. So how do we manage these relationships so that it is manageable? Yeah, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, like, not to just be crazy over here, but this is like so important. Like I don't know if there's a more important topic. Relationships are literally like everything that we do. Like, it is our work. And so, listeners, not to make you stressed out, but this is one of the most important things you probably like spend your time on. So what are some common mistakes that you see event professionals make in relationship management?
So we can start with, what ones have I made? No, I think in my experience, and then as I led teams in a corporate event, what I noticed the most is not, just communication in general, but that's way too broad. So the way I would say it is communicating expectations clearly, because if you are, one, able to communicate your expectations from an event, a person, a situation, and you are able to listen and understand their expectations, that is how you set boundaries. And when you have clear expectations and roles, responsibilities, boundaries, you build trust. And that is the foundation for all relationships. Even outside of events, but specifically in events. So I see a lot of people in our profession who are really good at communicating, but they're not really good at communicating expectations. They're also not really good at setting boundaries. So and setting boundaries doesn't just protect you, it also protects the people that you work with. And that's something that I think is missing from a lot of the education that we get, because we learn about Excel spreadsheets, we learn about how to do crisis management. But when it comes to creating communication plans and being able to speak your boundaries and accept other people's, that's something that I don't think that we are taught or that we project. We like to be people pleasers. You have referred to yourselves as that so many times. And it's like, well, yeah, of course you are. You run events. That's kind of our job. And then another one that I'm guilty of, especially early in my career, that I wish someone had taught me, when I was doing my first World Cup, is avoiding difficult conversations. So when you're on site an event, I don't know why I'm telling you this, listeners, when you're on site an event and it's fast paced, there's a million things going on. If you have a vendor who is irate about something, or you even have an attendee who's really upset about a situation, our default is to say, there are 53 things on fire. I'm not going to deal with that right now. Or we're going to just walk up and be like, hey, this is my decision. No discussion. That's it. Final, blah, blah, blah. Because we're just so ready to move on to the next thing. having difficult conversations, which is two-way, which includes listening to people and like actively listening to understand where they're coming from, and like taking the time, not checking your watch, not crossing your arms, which is what I do, not cutting off someone every time they try and talk. Again, me. Like, that is a huge mistake, because that'll immediately escalate the problem. And even if it's something happening in your production office in the back, people are going to feel it out front. Your stakeholders are going to feel it, your attendees, everyone, you're going to notice it. So it's avoiding those conversations or thinking that they're not important enough. Huge mistake. Huge mistake. Definitely. Those are the two top ones that come to mind.
Yeah, I feel like you just jarred for me. I mean, Gabby, even also knowing, and that comes with experience, I think, what conversations can happen via email or text message and what needs to be a phone call or a meeting. I mean, the amount of back and forth that you're like, we can have back and forth. They're like, hey, are you free for a call? Let's just talk. Like, to humanize it and be like, let me put a voice behind the words and the problem I'm trying to solve. It makes it harder for maybe the other person just to write it off and say no. And that is something that I know generationally, younger generations don't like phone calls. So that can be stressful in its own right. But I'm also just thinking, like, from a relationship perspective, knowing the correct mode of communicating, both on site, but also in like even that pre-event process, that can help you.
And in any situation, the one thing to remember as an event professional when you're thinking about your relationships is, at the end of the day, people want to be seen, heard, and appreciated. Those are the three concepts. So if picking up the phone rather than text message and just letting them say what they're feeling, making them feel heard, makes them feel appreciated, immediately de-escalates the situation. So while it sucks, and I sometimes hate the phone too, it's necessary and it's part of the job.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes easier said than done, but like you said, it's part of the job, and it's something that we can learn. So it's okay that if you're not good at it, it can be a skill that we can learn, which I think is really motivating. So with that in mind, what are the most critical stakeholder relationships event professionals need to prioritize, and why?
Okay, this is a trick question. I get asked this a lot. People are like, just tell me who I need to pay attention to. Trick question, because every single stakeholder is super important. What you need to focus on when you're talking about prioritizing relationships is you really need to sit back and, look at all of your stakeholders. I do something called stakeholder mapping, which is literally listing out every single stakeholder and then assigning them based on two factors. So their influence over your event. So like, how much can they influence the outcome of your event, and the interest in the outcome of your event. So when you're doing this, the people who are really high influence, like have a lot of say and power over your event and are really vested in the outcome, i.e. a sponsor spending a ton of money, the client that hired you, they are going to require a much different level of prioritization, communication, information. Those are the people that need to be in the decision process. Whereas people who, are really interested in the outcome of your event, but don't really have a lot of influence over it, you're probably not going to be providing them an ongoing deck of event planning. But you want to make sure that they have the correct level of communication, that they're getting, they know when tickets go on sale, they know where to find the event website and stuff like that. So it's like, you can't have a successful event if you don't acknowledge all of the stakeholders, but based on their influence and their interest, you can prioritize where the majority of your time goes. That's a trick question. Sorry. So the trick answer, I should say, if that makes sense, but it depends on your event. Mary, when we do fundraising events, clients, sponsors, hugely impactful, and volunteer boards. A lot of our events are run by volunteer boards. They're going to have a lot more say than Logan's on-site volunteer group that comes just to work day of, on-site coordination. So it really depends on your event, and you just have to look at their influence and their interest, if that makes sense.
No, that definitely does. And I feel like putting stakeholders in those different categories is so helpful. I mean, I don't know if I'm even that intentional with it sometimes, but just for me, it's always like so important to figure out from the jump, who are the decision makers, who are the people. Like, I think I just maybe do that work on the top and then I don't know if I do as well around the middle. But I like that. I think that idea of a map sounds really helpful for listeners, especially even if externally, I feel like I hop from so many teams, but especially I feel like you're an in-house planner and you're working with the same people, on an annual basis. Just figuring out that map can be so useful, even if it feels like it's a lot of work to get started.
Yeah, and it's a lot of work to maintain. And even if you're like, if Mary's working with clients, it's important for her and her team to sit down and do it, because then it also helps you with delegation. Like, okay, these are the VIPs, that's high interest, high influence on my map. Like, these are the people that require the most. You're really good with that type of people, Alicia. I don't know who Alicia is. You handle that. Where I, Mary, am really good with overseeing the volunteers. So like, these are our communication plans. Here are the point of contacts. And then it really helps you set boundaries and roles and responsibilities with your internal team. That's the way I use it.
No, that's amazing. And I think just kind of transitioning for our next question of just talking about technology, I
Mhm.
know you might not go in this direction, but AI is one we cannot get away from in any industry, I feel like. But what technology can help event planners with relationship management?
I love that you said AI. I'm hesitant to even say it, because anybody who's worked in a corporate event, like, I wasn't even allowed to use Chat GPT to write an email, because there's so many, the compliance is all over the place right now. But, since then, AI is a really helpful tool to help with personalization. So there are a lot of chatbots that can help you, even if it's just generating ideas for personalization of communication with your attendees, personalization with, your sponsors or whatever. That AI, that could be a whole separate conversation. But the technology specifically for relationship management is, so the stakeholder mapping that I mentioned and communication plans. So this is not really technologically advanced, but having like a a living document with your communication plan and your roles and responsibilities, everything listed out, maybe even shared with the stakeholder, just depending on what level they are. So everybody knows exactly who's communicating what, who's sending emails. So having an email system, I know we all have them and never use them, but like having those even as a solopreneur. And then auditing relationships is something that I do, which is essentially email marketing, but it's sending a form to my stakeholders and my team, and literally consistently and continuously evaluating the status of the relationships. Like, oh, they've been responding to every single email, but they haven't answered one phone call. Let's revamp that and take phone calls out of the communication plan, stuff like that. And then we've all dealt with CRMs, right? Customer relationship management. So may not make sense for a smaller business, but if you have a larger team, having a specific technology that can help you track touch points with all your stakeholders is invaluable. Like, oh, I haven't heard from sponsor X in 3 weeks. Do I need to call them immediately? You look in the CRM, you're like, oh, Logan talked to them last week. Of course you did. Everything's fine. So just making sure that there are no touch points missed. So it's so funny because I'm trying to apply technology to what we call a soft skill. I hate that term, but there are definite ways that it can help for sure.
I think that's a great call out. Absolutely. Because we have a project management system that we use, and we kind of have converted part of it to a CRM. And I think that's a really interesting point, because yes, we put stuff in there. We try to put like, contact information and things like that. But one of the things we added recently was like how recently we've talked to them, or kind of like where that level of relationship, I guess, is with them. And that's been super cool to kind of think through and kind of strategize around. So I think it's a great idea to use it for that type of thing. Shifting more into leadership now, which I'm very excited about. Leadership is something I've been trying to learn a lot about lately. What qualities and behaviors are most important for event professionals to develop, and why?
Okay. Well, I love this question. This is where we could talk for hours. So when it comes to leadership specifically in events, I think my number one, or like my foundation for leadership, is probably not what most people would default to. Like, you need to be able to communicate, you need to be adaptable. Those are certainly important, but I think having a really good understanding of emotional intelligence, which sounds really woo-woo, but hear me out. So if you can develop and flex your emotional intelligence, what that essentially means is you are in a much better position as a leader and event professional to understand your own emotion. So what does that mean? Like, I know what triggers me. I know what situations are super stressful for me. I know when I get upset. This is what grounds me. I can't have a conversation and like somebody's yelling at me and I'm going to woosa and give the perfect response. I need to take 5 minutes, breathe, and then revisit the conversation, and it's far more productive. So by understanding that about myself, when I get in, high conflict situations or even regular communication, I know where my strengths and my triggers are. So I know, one, I can explain that to people so they have expectations from me. They're like, okay, Gabby's going to need 5 minutes before she can have this conversation. We'll talk in 5 minutes in the break room. Or Gabby is going to need me to put this in an email after we have the conversation so she can reference it. Like, I'm able to ask for that because I understand myself. And the second part of emotional intelligence is once you have a better understanding of yourself, you can read around you. So you can't adapt to situations or people around you if you don't have that ability to, read the situation, understand their emotions, actively listen to what they're saying to you, and then respond appropriately. So I think emotional intelligence is like the number one foundation for all of the good leadership qualities. But like clear communication, like we talked about, being adaptable, not just in situations, but like to who you're talking to. Some people receive information and I know, Logan, you've talked about this before. You're really good at this. Like, some people learn really different ways. So I can't just put everything in an email, send it in a blast, and expect everyone to get all the information on the first time. Like, we have to be able to say, okay, I know that Dennis needs me to call and explain it, to a certain extent. We can only do so much. And then empathy. That's the last one. You have to be willing to put yourself in other people's shoes, and you have to be open for that type of hard conversation. I think those are the most important in my perspective.
No, that's I loved everything you just said, Gabby. I feel like just diving into what you talked about, clear communication, but we know, and we've talked about it on the podcast before, and I know Mary and I, it's so important, but how do you create that culture of clear, open communication with your event teams?
Well, first, you have to encourage feedback, whether it's as a boss or a leader to a team or as an event professional. You have to have a platform for feedback. So I talk about feedback loops a lot, and nothing bothers me more than like the only feedback that someone asks for is after an event, a 7-question survey that goes nowhere. So you have to be able to have continuous conversations about feedback. And if you want to develop open communication, you have to be willing to take it too. Everyone tells you when you're a boss, you're giving performance reviews, you're giving feedback. You need to be able to take it. And if your team can see that you can acknowledge when you're still learning something, or your team can see that you're willing to listen to feedback, they're going to be far more apt to do the same thing. And then celebrate and acknowledge people. Like that, it's one thing to just acknowledge when something goes wrong and talk about it. But this is something that we even talked about in the community. It's like, it's so easy to appreciate and acknowledge the people around you and like the people that work with you on events, no matter what level they are. And that goes so far. If you show any level of appreciation, people will remember that, and they're going to be more apt to continue a conversation with you.
And Gabby, do you mind repeating those? What were those 3 things you said? People's like needs, what they want to be like seen, heard, and appreciated.
Heard and appreciated. I think the original quote is valued, but when I translate things to events and in all my conversations, appreciated is far more prevalent in the answers than valued. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to be appreciated. No matter what level they are, how they are in relation to your event.
And how do we do that? Or what other leadership tips can we use when we're managing those on site or those day of teams? Because that seems like a whole other bear sometimes.
I know you guys have talked about, I think you had a whole episode about managing on site, and from a relationship perspective, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I'm going to keep saying it. It's a hold meetings, briefings, whatever, and be open with your communication. You need to have a clear outline, clear roles and responsibilities, and you have to have a place for people to ask questions. So whether it's pre-event, because we've all done volunteers come on site, don't even know what the event is, and you're giving them, this is how you take the tickets, this is how you do, and you're doing the lowdown. They're not truly invested in your event, because they don't know enough about it. So I think making sure that you have really clear roles and responsibilities and a place for them to ask questions or a point of contact for them to go to, I think that is super important as a leader. You have to be visible and you have to be accessible. And then again, celebrate wins throughout the day. Nothing helps morale more than that. Doesn't matter how small it is. It helps.
No, and I think that's so important, Gabby, because even communication, I mean, I count into like when I work with volunteers or teams, I try to empower them. If they see a problem they can easily solve themselves, they don't need to like come for permission. They can just do it. If it seems like it has a larger impact, please let me know, even if that's 5 minutes after the fact, or a text or something, even after you solved it. But to try to like empower them that they don't need to come to you for every little thing, I feel like is also important. But then also knowing by doing that, like mistakes might get made, and that's okay. Or if they don't know the answer to the question, where do they go? Are they
That's where
texting
your
you? Are they calling you?
walkie-talkies come in, Logan.
Yeah.
This is where Logan advocates for walkie-talkies. Someone's going to answer them if they need it, but empower them to make their own decisions. That's huge. Yeah, absolutely.
Gabby, you touched me that you remembered that. I'm just like, it's like crowd brain. You've got however many brains on your, it's impossible to think we would remember all these things. So.
Well, all I remember you talking about is, I don't remember in what context you were talking about, but like waiting for a text and knowing that they were typing a text, but not knowing like, oh, okay, is that, what are they, and like that. I have been in that situation so many times where I just, if we just had a walkie-talkie, and that was kind of like a duh moment for me hearing you say that. And for some reason that just sticks in my brain.
That's so funny. I do have a great anecdote from a project a month ago. And I don't think I told you, Mary, this, but I had a chat with all my producers in all my breakout rooms. And one of them texted, our speaker just died, but our tech's on it. And all of us like read that for a second, and you're in like a bunch of chats and stuff. And I'm like, did we just have a medical emergency? And then someone instantly replied back being like, speaker, you mean equipment, right? Like with a funny face. And she was like, oh my gosh, just reread that. Yeah, so sorry. It was the equipment. And so we gave her a hard time for the rest of the show. Yeah. Like it was one of those that I was like, communication's important, getting those speedy responses, but it was like out of context. We're like, wait, what? That has multiple meanings here.
And the tone would have been solved with a walkie-talkie. Yeah. You're 100%.
And I did give her a hard time. I said, I would expect if you had a medical emergency, you would have we had a walkie-talkie into. I was like, you would have walkied that first. So by the fact that you sent it as a text was more an FYI.
Yeah, that's funny. I mean, terrifying, but funny.
Yeah. Well, getting back into the kind of talking about partnerships and relationship management, how can event pros cultivate that long-term partnership with their clients and their vendors?
It's essentially everything we've been talking about. Do that and you're great. But no, it's providing value beyond your event. So making sure that you are having continuous conversation. You're checking in with them. As soon as you have the date for next year, you're reaching out and saying, hey, are you available? Or, hey, are you willing to work with me again? Continuously asking, what did you think about this? And getting their information. I mean, just providing value beyond the event. That is super important. And creating that culture of trust and respect. If you have that trust and respect, it is a lot easier for people to want to get involved again. It's essentially everything we've been talking about. And then just being consistent and following through. That sounds so easy, but like following through on your promises and what you're telling people that you're going to provide, you do that, they're coming back, it's like, that sounds so simple, but it's a lot of people don't do that. And that's super important. Don't make promises you can't keep.
That's absolutely true. This is not probably a good thing, Gabby, but lately I've like stopped saying in emails, I'll get this to you by end of day Friday, because I can't do it. I just say soon.
That is exactly what you need to do. You're setting those expectations and boundaries, and that means they're not expecting it by Friday. So you're not going to disappoint them if it's not there by Friday. Like that's so important. That's so important. That vulnerability is important.
Or even on the flip side, I think I've gotten better at asking clients when they say they want something from me. It's like, do you have a deadline in mind? Like verbalizing it so that I'm not missing their unspoken expectations and I'm not letting them down and not knowing I was. Because that's been helpful, because urgent has a very different timeline depending on the person. Someone's like, I need it soon. And I was like, do you want to put a date on that? And as soon as 2 weeks from now, I was like, that's different. I would have heard that as 2 days from now.
Ambiguity can tank an event Can tank your relationship, but it can tank an event. That's so true. It's good that you're asking those questions because that's the only way you're going to know.
So as we get closer to the end of the year, it's kind of an interesting reflection. Are there any recommendations you have for event pros to do differently or think about going into the next year?
First of all, survive Q4. That's my number one. Do what you got to do to survive Q4. But no, as the new year approaches, some things that I like to do to set myself up to be in a really good place for the next year, and I'll do this as soon as, this season is over for me too, is I do those relationship audits. So people that I know I'm collabing with or that I want to collab with or I have in the past or in any capacity, any stakeholder that I'm involved with, I'll do an evaluation, which sometimes is basically me reflecting and saying, okay, this is what I could have done better. This is what was missing. Sometimes it's asking them to have a debrief conversation and just saying, how did this work for you? How did you feel about that? Does this make sense going forward? So just auditing those relationships and trying to figure out where you stand is the best way to start the year. So you know exactly what position you're in going forward. And you know what plan of communication you need to work on and develop. It should be the first thing you do when you start working with someone, but you have to keep doing it. And then set goals. Take that audit and use that to set goals. You guys are great about setting end of year goals or beginning of year goals and then reflecting them at the end. It's use the reflection on where your relationships stand and set goals for it. Like, where do you want this relationship to go? Who do you want to be your number one sponsor for Better Events Conference next year? Set goals about starting and maintaining that relationship, stuff like that. And then don't be afraid to reflect on your own personal growth as a leader. My biggest pet peeve is when an event professional says, well, I'm not a leader. I don't have any direct reports or I don't have anyone that works with me. Wrong. If you work in events, you're a leader. You lead volunteers, you lead vendors, you lead manage up. You are a leader, and developing those skills is usually only offered to middle management. Don't be afraid to seek it out because those skills will help you as an event professional in any sector of the industry at any level. So if you take some time in your slower season to develop your leadership skills, it's only going to make you better.
Gabby, we could keep talking to you, I'm sure, for hours about this. But as we get to the end of the episode, is there anything else you want to add about relationship management for our listeners?
No, I just don't want people to be afraid of it. And I want people to understand that you don't have to be born with it. Some people are born people's people. Some people are born leaders. You can learn how to do this and you can develop the training or develop the skills with training. And even if you are really good at it, you two are phenomenal at this. You could benefit from training and development because things change so often. Being a good leader pre-2020, people had to relearn those skills post-pandemic, So I just want to encourage people to seek out the training, learn about emotional intelligence, learn about your leadership. It will not only help your events run much more smoothly, but it'll protect you and your mental health and your burnout capacity.
Thank you, Gabby. I think that's so true. And I'm motivated. So I'm sure listeners are too, to try something, learn a little something new. We can all expand on these skills. So Gabby, before we let you go, can you please share where listeners can find you and follow along on your journey?
Oh, of course. I'm LinkedIn. So Gabriella Robbucio, which that's a lot of letters, I know, but it'll be in the, I'm sure it'll be in the episode description, but I'm on LinkedIn, Gabriella Robbucio. And I do post a lot of these little tips and tricks on Instagram under ProEventTips. So please follow me, reach out if you have any questions. I'm always happy to answer questions. Clearly, I enjoy talking, so I'm happy for anyone to reach out.
Thank you so much, Gabby. This has been amazing.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah. And that brings us to our bonus tip, which, Mary, you have this week.
I do. And this was pre-planned before we had our discussion, but this fits perfectly for what we talked about today. So today, my bonus tip is to make sure that you get some key phone numbers before you do day of event coordination. So that might be your first, time that you're on site, you're meeting everybody in that moment. But as soon as you get there, figure out who the key people are and get their phone numbers. This just happened to me. And I all of a sudden was in a really sticky moment. And I was like, I don't have a way to get a hold of anybody. It caused me a huge headache. It stressed me out. I could have just gone ahead of that a little bit better by doing it right when I arrived. So if you're doing day of event coordination, don't forget to get key phone numbers for that day. And that is my bonus tip for today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mary. And that brings us to the end of our episode. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Better Events Pod. You can send us an email at bettereventspod@gmail.com. You can connect with Mary and I directly as well. We love hearing from you, and we love when you put a little note in there if you know us from the podcast. That definitely helps us. And if you want more Better Events content, you can register for our 2024 Better Events Conference, learn more about our speakers, our agenda, all the latest information at bettereventspod.com/conference. Or you can join Gabby and some other really cool event pros in our private community on Substack. And as always, we thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back with you next Wednesday.